My name's Georgia Condell, and I'm the curate here at St James by the Park. And as Josh has already said, this is sort of a second half, really, of the sermon that Lena gave last week. We were introduced to Peter and the other disciples. Peter has decided to go fishing. And we're not told why. We're not told how Peter is feeling. Prior to Jesus' crucifixion, Peter had been the confident one. Sometimes a little cocky, even, you might say, a little arrogant. Really sure of his wholehearted commitment to Jesus. As we saw in the video earlier, it's Peter who says, "Even if everybody else leaves you, I never will." And yet, the very night that he said that, Peter, just as vehemently as he declared his loyalty to Jesus, denies him publicly 3 times. So I wonder again, as I look at this scripture, how is Peter feeling now? Guilty? Probably. Disheartened? Disillusioned? Weak? Perhaps he goes fishing because it's what he knows how to do. Something he's good at. Perhaps he thinks it will make him feel better. A distraction. I wonder what you do when you have done something wrong and are feeling guilty. What is your knee-jerk reaction? Do you, like Adam and Eve, blame someone else? Someone else told me to do it. It wasn't my fault. Or do you, like me, particularly when I was a child, run away and hide? That was certainly something that Adam and Eve did. Their default, they hid from God. I wonder a little if this is what Peter is doing here. After all, Jesus had called him away from fishing, hadn't he? To become a fisher of men. Hadn't he commissioned him to be the rock on which his church was to be built? The wonderful thing for you and I and for Peter is that when we mess up, when we do something wrong, Jesus, just as with God in the Garden of Eden, he never leaves us there in our hiding. He comes to find us. Jesus comes to find Peter. And I'm sure that he is choosing this moment as a reminder to Peter of his very first calling. Because, of course, what happens is that Peter and the disciples have been fishing all night. They've caught nothing. And it is Jesus who directs them to this miraculous catch. Just as he did when they first met, just as they did when Peter was first called by Jesus. And the parallels cannot have been lost on Peter or the other disciples. But here in this passage, as we saw, Peter and the other disciples are enjoying a barbecue on the beach with Jesus. I particularly love the way that Jesus waits until Peter has eaten, until he's been fed, to address the elephant in the room, or the elephant on the beach. Peter's public denial of knowing Jesus. And I think there's something to dwell on here about food. I like food. Firstly, Jesus feeds Peter and the disciples. And then in Peter and Jesus' exchange, Jesus tells him twice to feed his sheep or feed his lambs. And I think there's something we can take from that, a principle, that we can't feed others unless we ourselves have been fed by Jesus. I know for myself that unless I have spent time with Jesus, being fed and nourished by him, that I'm pretty useless as a preacher and pretty useless as a church leader. I need Jesus to feed me. And Peter needs feeding. You and I need feeding. And if we want to be fruitful Christians, we need to give Jesus time to feed us through his word, through prayer, through listening. But let's look at this conversation between Jesus and Peter in a little bit more depth. I wonder whether you imagine that this conversation is happening in front of the disciples, or does Jesus take Peter aside? The text isn't particularly clear, but my gut says that it was important that Peter's restoration and forgiveness for his very public denials of Jesus were also a public restoration. I think the other disciples were listening in. Certainly the fact that John writes this account in such detail would suggest that. And so Jesus' first question to Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Makes sense if the disciples are listening in. Now, the Greek here is not particularly clear. Jesus could be referring to the boats and the fishing paraphernalia. But either way, it is a challenge to Peter about his priorities. Peter, who had so confidently asserted before how much more devoted and committed he was to Jesus than any of the others. Remember what he said. Even if all these desert you, I never will. Now, I've talked a little bit about the Greek here, and I don't always mention it, but it is important in this passage that we recognize some of the nuances of the language here. In Greek, many of you will know, there are lots of different words for love. And in this passage, we see two different words used. We see the agape word used. And agape is kind of the highest form of love. It's sacrificial love. It's the giving all love. But we also see the philos love mentioned. And philos is affection or friendship. So when Jesus asks Peter if he loves him, he uses the agape word. Do you love me? Do you love me sacrificially? But when Peter replies, you know I love you, he uses the philos word. He uses the friendship, affection word. So here's what I think's going on. When Jesus asks Peter, do you love me enough to sacrifice everything for me? Do you love me more than these? I think Peter realizes he doesn't. After all the confident assertions before Jesus' crucifixion, after all the boasting about how he would lay down his life for Jesus, Peter recognizes the truth about himself, that his love for Jesus is not complete. And for me, that's the first step in Peter's restoration. It's an honest assessment of himself and where he is. When Jesus asks the second time, again using the agape word, do you love me with all your heart? Do you love me sacrificially? Peter again replies with the philos word, I love you as a friend. And then when Jesus asks a third time, do you love me? This time, Jesus uses the philos word. Do you love me as a friend? And for me, that makes more sense as to why Peter felt so hurt. It wasn't just that Jesus asks 3 times in a direct mirroring of Peter's 3 denials. It was surely also that Jesus stops using the agape word. He comes down, if you like, to Peter's level of commitment, to where Peter is. He meets Peter where he's at, not where Peter thinks he ought to be. I think many of Peter's problems in the past have been that he had promised far more than he could ever deliver. So how does this passage speak to you and I? What does it say to us when we are feeling guilty? Perhaps when we are hiding from God, feeling far from him, feeling we've messed up yet again. We may not verbally have denied Jesus, but through our actions and thoughts, we have. I think the wonderful thing for all of us is that Jesus comes to meet us. I often think of the wonderful parable of the prodigal son. The prodigal son is guilty of wasting all his father's inheritance. He runs out of money, runs out of dignity, and he decides nonetheless to go home. And the father, rather than reject him, rather than coolly wait for him to come to him, rather than the son to come to the father rushes to meet him and wraps his arms around him. Think of Jesus cooking breakfast on the shore for Peter and the other disciples. God longs to meet us where we are. Jesus longs to meet you and I where we are. And I think that's the problem for many of us. We have this false belief that somehow we have to sort ourselves out. We have to be good enough before we can come to Jesus. But that's not the gospel, is it? It's not the gospel that I've read. It's not the Jesus I know. Jesus died for me, for my sins. And he wants us to come as we are. He doesn't expect you and I to have everything sorted, just as Peter didn't have everything sorted. All he asks is that we come to him. Just like Peter, who jumped out of the boat and swam to Jesus as soon as he realized it was him. He wants us to come, to honestly acknowledge our faults and sins to him, and he will do the rest. What does he ask for? Well, like Peter, he asks for our love, however imperfect, however flawed. And he will do the rest. In Hebrews 12, verse 2, it says, Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith. He will do the work in us as we yield ourselves to him. The passage ends with a rather strange but poignant prediction by Jesus. Jesus, of course, had earlier predicted Peter's denial of him, and here in this passage he predicts his death. Peter, of course, went on to lead the church, went on to be an amazing apostle and evangelist, and died, we're pretty sure, in Rome during the Emperor Nero's persecution of the Christians in 64 AD. He's crucified on a cross, just as Jesus was, although tradition says that he chose to be crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy to be crucified in the same way as Jesus did. Such is the restoration work that Jesus achieved in Peter, that he did indeed reach that point of agape, that sacrificial love, that laying down of his life for Jesus. Jesus may not ask you and I to do the same, but nonetheless, Jesus says to you and I today, do you love me? Let's answer that question honestly and vulnerably, and ask him to work in us just as he did in Peter, to bring us from a place of honest vulnerability into the calling he has on your life and on mine. God has a calling for you. He doesn't want to leave you where you are now. You may not be destined to be the leader of the worldwide church as Peter was, but he nonetheless has a calling for all of us. And as we make time to be fed by Jesus, nurtured and changed, he will show you. I've seen God do it in my own life, and I pray that he continues to do that. Don't fall for Satan's lie that you've messed up so much that God can't possibly ever use you. It's not true. Just look at Peter. Jesus' arms are outstretched, just as the father of the prodigal son was. He says, come, in your messiness, in your guilt, in your doubt, in your sin. Come to me. Let me feed you. Let me begin to do my work in you. Let me show you all that I have for you.